Nope, monitor off. Okay, now it's working. Great. Wonderful. One of these days, I'm going to figure this out where I hopefully can start and end a stream without fiddling with software and just getting things right. Anywho, hope you're doing well today. It is February 25th, 3:05 p.m. here in Toronto, Canada. My name is Q, and today we are going to be going through the process of planning and breaking down a base modal component that you may find in any kind of component library or design system or whatever the case may be. And oh my goodness, there are a couple of components that live within design systems that I absolutely love, and also at the same time kind of die a little bit inside when I have to work with them just because of how difficult they are. It's like if you're really into Sudoku and then you just find a Sudoku puzzle that just like you take forever on. And those components are modals, popovers, and drop downs, and tooltips. Tooltip popovers are kind of the same thing. Those things, anything that has to do with a layer that pops up with the potential of nesting, right? So you can have a modal with a pop-up inside, or you can have a modal that triggers another modal, things like that. With keyboard, things kind of inherently built into the experience. So if you have a modal, you have to press escape to close it and so on. Things of that nature I really, really enjoy just because of how challenging they are and typically how underestimated they are in terms of difficulty. So for today's video, I'm going to walk through the process of planning it through based on my personal experience. And great. Cool. With that out of the way, let's get started. So I have right now a blank Figma file that I will be sharing in the YouTube description so that you can check it out. And we're going to take a look at several kind of modal UIs just to kind of get a sense of what it is we're trying to build. Okay. So just found some modal UIs on Dribbble. So here we have one. And right now I'm trying to identify common patterns, so desired features that we would like in our modal. So it has to be some box of some kind, of course. It has to have a title of some kind. It has to have this little X close button. So I'm just going to mock this up real fast. So we have a box of some kind, just giving it a 10 stroke. Make it white, sure. And then we got to have a title of some kind, maybe a subtitle. I've seen that in some places. There are sirens going off, so I apologize if you're hearing anything, any of that. Okay, and then we have to have a close button of some kind. Cool. What else do we need? We need to be able to render body content of some kind. Make this white. And of course, we need footer content of some kind. Great. All right, so we have the foundations roughly of our modal, and let's just continue to explore. So right off the bat, I'm noticing something interesting between this design and this design. There's nothing right or wrong, it's just more of an aesthetic stylistic choice. So for this one, the footer and the header, there is no kind of separation between the two. They blend seamlessly into the body, right? There's no border, the body's not of a different color and so on. Whereas this one, there is a clear separation between the header, the footer, and also the body based on the color and also a border. Depending on the aesthetics of your application or your component library or design system, you would leverage those kinds of aesthetics to apply onto your modal. So that's something to be mindful of. Right now, besides that, there's no real change between this one and this one. Okay, this one has an animated GIF. Here is a non-animated version. I think this is the same one, maybe, not sure. So right here, we see a big difference. there is no title in this particular modal. I'm seeing you've probably seen these kinds of modals come up, or dialog boxes come up every now and then for more action-driven kind of experiences. So for this one, it's like add a payment method or delete a virtual machine, something that requires a single action and also more focused attention from the user. So this one, there is no footer, there is no title, there's no header rather, but there's a gigantic icon, there is a header, there's some header text here, there's some body text here, and also your action, your delete or your setup payment method. So right off the bat, my thinking is we've established that we perhaps may need several parts. So I'm just going to duplicate this so that, whoops, this may be the base configuration, and now we have something like that for the header, and then something like this for the body. Great. Okay. So we somehow need to be able to render the modal with perhaps just the body, so it can just do this, right? And the body can render whatever it is it wants inside. In this case, perhaps a blank slate component that may exist in somewhere else in your component library or design system, with an accompanying icon and also button. So something like that, perhaps. So we have already a couple of potential configurations. This one and this one is basically the same. It just this one, there's a clearer kind of, you can Jesus. You can clearly see the pieces, right? We have the header, the body, and the footer. Here we just have the body. We just have the body content. Okay, next one. This one is a little bit harder to see, but the detail I wanted to point out was there could be, from an aesthetic standpoint, an alternative color for perhaps the body, the header, or maybe the footer, right? So here the main color of the modal is, for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to say white or gray. And the alternative is to feature the primary color for the header or the body or the footer, just for that kind of, I don't know, aesthetic oomph to the UI. So that's something to consider, where we might have to do something like this. Okay, this guy, let's make it, for simplicity's sake, let's do that. Let's make this one white. So here, detail. The close button has to be somewhat aware of its background color in order to render itself to be the ideal color to contrast against it. So what I mean by that is, it's a very subtle detail, but here the main color of the modal, that being white or gray, the close button would need to be slightly kind of transparent purple, that being the main color, whereas here it would be a slightly kind of transparent white to contrast against the main purple color. So that's a little bit of thing to pay attention to. This one is also interesting. This modal kind of follows a similar kind of design paradigm where you just have a box with a body. The difference is there is no close. Instead, there is a meatball or options or whatever menu that you have, kebab, whatever you call it, triple dot menu, that my guess is to reveal some sort of drop down with additional options. So there may be a potential that there is no X whatsoever, and you have this instead. Okay, cool. Interesting. And this last one, let's take a look-see. Yeah. So the aesthetics are a little bit different here, in that there may be an icon that appears before on the left of the title and the subtitle. So depending on the kind of aesthetics you want for your application, That may be something that you would like to support, maybe not. It's not too common, I think, to kind of have a modal with something that looks like this. But I'm just going to draw that out for now. And I believe these are most of our use cases for a modal UI. Okay? So, I think the key to doing this in a way that feels very seamless to use from a design system and component library perspective is to create enough of the parts so that the next front-end developer or whoever can construct a modal without having to pluck a bunch of little parts together to enable them to compose the thing. So by that, I mean, they shouldn't have to, if they wanted to render a UI like this, say this is the base desired UI for your modal, right? They shouldn't have to, Jesus. Come on, select the thing and duplicate the thing. Oh my goodness. Duplicate the thing. Okay, cool. Oh my goodness, I didn't mean to do that. Apologies. Yes. Oh, the subtitle's missing. Where is that gone? It's fine. Whatever. They shouldn't have to like bring 7 or 12 components together just so that they can construct the header, for example. They should just use one, and then the rest should be taken care of for them for the base kind of desired UI for the modal. However, all of those bits should be available, in my opinion. This is a design choice from a component library perspective. All of those parts should be available in case they would like to have a more customized UI. So you have some flexibility there. The default's to take care of the majority of the use cases, but smaller parts of the API to enable control. Right, so these are just the various parts of the modal. There are more things that go into it. So all right, so I'm just going to write down some, one of these days I will learn how to use design programs. Anyway, we have the UI parts here. But one very common thing for modals is to have this kind of shadow, right? You might see that here. You'll see this here. The shadow is a aesthetic thing to indicate that this is floating. This little box that you're seeing is floating on top of something else. So the term that is most commonly used nowadays is elevation. And Material does a very good job of indicating elevation for various UI parts. So here we can see that this, well, maybe this is easier to see. I don't know. For me, this is a little bit confusing. But the idea is you have one piece of something floating on something else, and you need some sort of visual indicator to indicate depth. That's what elevation is, and usually that is done using drop shadow of some kind. So we need elevation. Some sort of, I'm just going to write something here. Systems. And by systems, it doesn't necessarily have to mean something complicated. It could just be a configuration set, right? Elevation, usually there is a collection of values that you can draw from. By draw, I mean that you can get. So if you have an elevation of 0, there's no shadow, and then 1, slightly more shadow, and then you continue into like 8 or whatever it is your system may have. Let's see, material elevation values. Usually there's a code pen or a something that illustrates how many elevation levels there are. Maybe this is a better one. Come on. Okay, I'm going to give up in 10 seconds if I can't find it. All right, here. So here we have, in this example, they labeled it card 1, card 2, 3, 4, 5. And here we can see that there's various elevations based on the value that you've chosen for this particular box or card. So Yeah, it can just be as simple as having a set of values associated for elevation. The other thing is you, in addition to shadow, I'm just going to write this underneath it, shadow. You also need to have, in the context of web, and this is how I'm going to approach it just because I'm the most familiar with web, you need to have some sort of ZIndex configuration or system, right? And the reason for that is because it helps not guarantee, but more reliably render your modal on top of other parts of your application. Far too often, you'll run into a situation, and this is probably something you've experienced, when you've tried to adopt things like Bootstrap, Material UI, or some sort of CSS framework or component library into your existing application, which is fine. Out of the box, it works fine. But the moment you need to add additional customized implementations of things, customized popovers, dialog boxes, or whatever the heck, unless there is some sort of source of truth ZIndex system, you're just going to be throwing random values there, which over time, there's no consistency, they'll fight against each other, and then you'll notice that modals aren't popping up and overlaying on top of other things as you'd expect it to. Why? Oh, it's because there's a ZIndex of 1241 for reasons that was committed 2 years ago. Well, okay, 1241, I need this to be a little stronger. Let's make it 999. Oh, there's already 999, or well, 99999. And then this pattern continues and it's bad. So having some sort of managed ZIndex system is very helpful in managing things that require layering and elevation within your UI. So we have elevation and shadow. So that's one thing. Great. The other thing that is, let's see, get Bootstrap, that we will need, components, modal, right. Open a modal. Open the modal, right. So the other thing that we will need is some sort of animation system. So in this case, we have the two parts of this modal. We have an overlay that is this kind of transparent black background thing that overlays on top of everything else. And then we have the actual modal itself that sits on top of the overlay. The overlay can be a separate component that you can use for other scenarios, or it can be part of the modal. We can get into that. So just so that we'll remember, we'll draw. Oh man, this zooming thing. I feel like I'm using design apps wrong, because this accidental zooming in as max as you can go isn't something that I experience only in Figma. I've experienced this a lot in Illustrator as well for many years. Anywho, so we need some sort of overlay system or overlay component that works in conjunction with our modal to block everything else and also to add emphasis onto the dialogue itself. And we need some sort of animation. Whoops. Some sort of animation engine or system to handle how these things kind of interact. So it's very subtle. I wish I can slow this down. Maybe there's a way to do that. I'm not too sure. But the moment we click launch demo modal, the overlay will appear. It'll fade in, and then the modal would come down and fade in from the very top. So there's a sequencing of these two various parts of how they come in. And when you close it, the inverse of that happens. And typically, for modals, this is a really good example, is modals leverage a technique called portaling, which has been added as part of, officially, as part of React 16. And the idea of portaling, if you're not familiar, is basically to render the piece of UI that may have been triggered from its origin, or the original point, in this case, some deeply nested button within the UI of this website. right? The idea of portaling is to render this modal somewhere at the root body level. So the best way I can do this is to open up VS Code and to write some garbage code, or rather pseudocode that may look something like this. We have our app. Sorry, we have our body. Okay, and then we have our app, and then we have some nested stuff, and then we have a container of some kind for some UI, and then we have our modal button, right? The thing that triggers the modal to appear, that lives inside the container, that lives within the app, that lives within the body. Cool. And this may be nested an arbitrary amount within your application. So what you don't want happening is you don't want your modal, which is in reality like a div with a class of whatever. It's just going to write modal for now. So in reality, you don't want your modal to render here. You want this modal component to be injected right here, or somewhere here, somewhere at the root body level. The reason for that is because you don't want any styles that may be within your arbitrary nested application of where the modal button appears to affect how the modal appears within your UI. You don't want any kind of like unpredictable CSS thing that may change the background, may change the width, the sizing, the border box, the overlay, the whatever. You don't want any of that to affect your modal. So you want to render it in the root body level, and to do that you leverage a technique called portaling, which is thankfully fully supported as part of React 16. However, React 16, this portal technique, it's the very, very bare bones API to just get that working. If you want a better kind of portaling system, that's something that you'll have to either build or leverage a library to do. By better portaling system, I mean something to kind of handle accessibility things or coordination between the portal component and something else. So for now, I'm just going to write here. We need some sort of portaling system. And since I mentioned accessibility, there are some things within modals that we have to be considerate. We have to consider when we build them from a accessibility and also interaction perspective. Let's see. Reakit, written by my boy Diego Haas, coworker of mine, fantastic, very, very smart person, absolutely wonderful library. So Reakit, what this does is it implements the accessibility standards that you would expect for a dialogue UI in the context of web, and it kind of does a lot of the things for you out of the box. So you don't necessarily need to tie ARIA attributes for certain UI pieces. It kind of does that for you automatically using this kind of use dialog state, which is a common pattern within Reakit, which I absolutely love. You use some sort of state and you just spread those props onto the particular triggers or the bits of UI, and it kind of underneath the hood, there are mechanisms that kind of coordinates everything for you. So leveraging some sort of accessibility driven library of some kind would be very handy for your modal. And this is not just for your modal, it's for anything within your application. Popovers, tooltips, dropdowns, accordions, anything. So having something like this is already super helpful. So something with accessibility, which is great. What else do we need? We talked about shadow, elevation, we talked about animation, we talked about portaling, there's accessibility stuff. And I think that may be it. I may revisit the systems that we have. Another thing to kind of consider for your portaling system, right? You have to determine whether your application, your component library, your design system supports the notion of having nested modals. This is an interaction that is debated quite heavily within the UX community or within designers. It's a choice that you have to make. So if you do decide to have nested modals, then you have to build the mechanisms and the systems to support this thing. What I mean by that is, and this is something that you will find that a lot of libraries struggle with, whether it's Bootstrap or React Bootstrap, Material, whatever. Just because out of the box, supporting nested modals isn't really a thing. And also, if you could nest modals, therefore you could potentially trigger a popover from a modal, right? So now you have multi-layered nested portaled components. So that means that you could have modals that are nested 3 levels deep that happen to trigger a popover or that happen to trigger a dropdown from within. So now you can have something like modal. Maybe this is not necessary, but maybe, right? That has a dropdown that may have a tooltip underneath, it may have a popover underneath for reasons. Reasons is the best reasons. So you may have something like this. And the reason why I bring this up is, let's pretend you have some sort of portaling system for these to kind of render on top of each other and is able to give the appropriate ZIndex so that things kind of intelligently and automatically lay on top of each other. There's no conflict and everything is fine. The difficulty, though, is coordinating the escape or closing sequence for all of these elements. What I mean by that is, if you build modals, popovers, drop-downs, tooltips, if you build all of these components in isolation, typically what happens is there is some sort of mechanism where it's like press escape to close, right? For all of them, which is the desired kind of functionality that you want to have, which is great. But once you have these things that aren't aware of each other, but now needing to work with each other, and that leverage the same interaction pattern, that is press escape to close, when you press escape to close, all of them will close because they don't know how to coordinate with each other. They don't talk to each other, right? So you need underneath some sort of mechanism or system that is able to help these guys communicate with each other so that when you either press escape to close or tab or do whatever, they know how to coordinate themselves so that when you press escape, this closes, this closes, this closes, this closes, this closes after 5 escape presses. So within your portaling system, you need some sort of portal stack system going on, so that anything you build with your portal system has portal stacking built into it, so that for individual components, whether it's a modal, it's a dropdown, it's a popover, you don't have to manually kind of babysit that interaction. And man, when I build components or design systems or whatever, it's the feeling of having to be super verbose about something, to be super mindful of something, or to like basically babysit a bunch of kind of key presses or whatever. It feels very, very tiring. So to have subsystems like an accessibility system, an animation system, an elevation system, or a portaling system take care of all that for you, so that you can just construct your portal. You can just your modal. You can just construct your drop down. It's great. So it's worth investing and to be mindful of these subsystems. So portal. The other one is let me see if I can get the example. I think ReaKit does a good job of this. The other one is to have focus trapping. Let's see if it does this. Focus trapping. Yeah. So RiaKit, God bless RiaKit, has focus trapping kind of built into the dialogue system, I believe. Right? So I don't know if you can hear me tapping. I'm pressing tab at the moment, and tab presses don't escape the portaled dialogue component. What I mean by that is initial focus. Yeah. So here you can see it's tabbing. Hopefully you can see. It's tabbing. If I press tab, it tabs to the button. If I press tab, it tabs to the portal or the dialogue itself. And if I press tab again, it cycles between the dialogue and its contents. It doesn't jump beyond or outside of the dialogue box. And within the context of UI, this kind of system or this kind of pattern is known as focus trapping. So I'm going to write this here, which may or may not be part of accessibility handling, depending on how you look at it. I probably consider that to be a different mechanism just because you may need focus trapping in other scenarios, right? It's not solely part of accessibility, although it is definitely part of it, but it's not. How do I rephrase this? I don't know what I'm saying. You can use focus trapping outside of purely accessibility. That's what I'm trying to say. Cool. Good. Moving on. And lastly, I think we need something to do with UI, aesthetics. And what I mean by that is you need some sort of, you need to handle styling. You need to style this bad boy somehow. And I can get into this very briefly. And ideally, you would probably like to have some sort of theming mechanism built into this as well. And by theming, what I mean by that is underneath the hood, when you write your UI, when you construct the UI for your modal, out of the box, it might be automatically aware to render itself in dark mode or light mode, depending on the user preference set by the operating system. So in macOS, you can tell your operating system, hey, I prefer light, I prefer dark, something like that, or based on user preferences within your application. So maybe in your app like Twitter and YouTube, they're starting to support this stuff where the user can choose whether they want light mode or dark mode. So having some sort of something like that, which is typically a theming system built as part of your UI system or styling system, is helpful in constructing your modal. Otherwise, you'll just be monkey patching this kind of stuff on top, which doesn't scale very well. So I think these are basically the systems or the subsystems that we need to think about when if we want to attempt to construct something like a modal. Now let's take a look at the UI parts. Oh geez. Okay. UI parts. Cool. What do we need? So, from a UI perspective, we have to have a header, we have to have a body, and then we have to have a footer of some kind, as it appears so far. So, we need to have a header, we need to have a body, we need to have a footer, and this is just part of our modal component, right? So now we have these pieces. We also have to have some sort of close mechanism or close button. So what's interesting though is depending on your design, right? You may not need this part, just because if you decide within your UI that all modals must have a header, right? So therefore these particular UIs cannot exist, right? You've decided in your system that all modals must have a header. If that's the case, then the close mechanism could be inherently part of your header. Therefore, you may not need to expose that bit because you don't need to create little custom configurations between whether to show a close button or not. But since we've established in our desired modal situation, we would like to have some sort of UI where there is no header, then we have to have this kind of close button right there. Cool. Looking typically, if you take a look at, this is a bad example, so I need to see some actual UI. Great. Something like this or something like this. I'm just going to grab this screenshot so we have something to take a look at. Plop. Seriously? Why is it so small? It's fine. Whatever. Whatever. It's fine. So we take a look at this guy, right? Wait. My screenshot looks like it's cut off. Oh, there we go. Oh, Figma's doing fancy resized things. All right, cool. So by taking a look at this and potentially something like, I need something else. Sure, this one. These two are great examples. Okay. A modal typically is just an enhanced card component. Cards have become very popular within UIs and they're used in various other places. Modals are just elevated cards with the closing mechanism built inside. So what that means is you actually need something like this. You actually need, so you have a modal. I'm just going to try to break these bits apart. You have a modal, you have a close, you have a header, you have a body, you have a footer. And what this actually means is you have a card component. The modal is actually, how do I do this? I wish I could, typically how I plan this stuff is I draw, right, with either with pen and paper or on my tablet or something like this. It's very difficult for me to do UI within the context, UI planning within the context of Figma, but I'm going to try my best. Oh, please just resize the text so it doesn't just do things. Why can't it be in line? Please. There we go. All right, good. Okay, great. So we have things. So a modal body is just a card body. A footer is just a card footer. Okay? So these components could be reused to construct your modal. They should relatively be the same UI unless you need to do some sort of fancy something to enhance it. But we're going to assume that these are just basically your card components that are going to be reused within your modal. Cool. So here is a very interesting design detail. You could do something like this. How do I change this so that it is React? Great. So let's say my library, okay? So I've seen some libraries that kind of do this. Why do I keep typing the word Cody? I don't know why. Body, card, footer. So I've seen some examples that kind of look like this, where they basically have all the bits, but they kind of tell you to construct the modal experience or whatever it is you want with those bits, which is fine, but just from a kind of developer experience, user overhead perspective, it feels like you have to first understand that there are these bits in order for you to compose them together. It's something that's typically it's easy to forget, right? So with that in mind, when you're building your component library, you want to optimize for that use case. You don't want you want to reduce the chances of someone forgetting to use a particular component and configure it in a certain configurations that makes your library happy. And So what you can do is maybe you, instead of having card header, you have, let's see, modal. Now you don't need card, and now you can do, whoop. So now you can do something like this, which just from reading the API or just from reading how these components are composed together, it makes a lot more sense. I don't need to understand that this thing is using a card. I'm just focused on building the modal, right? So it's a very tiny detail, but something definitely to consider when you're constructing your components and planning out the kind of API you want to expose for fellow developers. So having something like this, I think, would be good. Also, when you're in the process, I'm now in the process, hypothetical process of planning out the various UI bits. I find it incredibly useful and helpful to write pseudocode like this, just because I want the API to feel good and to feel easy to use if I were to be another developer. Because as a UI engineer or someone working in this space, it's also part of your responsibility and your job to make sure these APIs feel as intuitive as possible, right? UI rendering is one thing, performance is another thing, composition, all that stuff is other stuff. But ultimately, for other developers, this thing has to feel intuitive to use, right? Your job is to make this stuff easier. So I find it very helpful to kind of pseudocode or whiteboard code how potential APIs may work. And this is also very helpful when you're planning out the various props, right? So if you have something like has close button or something like that, it's helpful to kind of write this stuff out just to see maybe over time how much or how many little props are required to make your modal behave, to make your modal work out of the box. And ideally, you want to reduce that as much as possible so that they can probably, for the most part, compose and create a modal just by writing a couple of lines. That is the ideal. To be able to use your thing by writing like as little lines of code as possible, because your library intelligently takes care of the rest. Cool. So we have the various mechanisms, the various UI components that constructs the modal header, the modal itself, the visual modal itself. We have the header, we have the body, we have the footer, we have the close, and now we need the overlay. Okay, so overlay as part of the modal may be exclusive to the modal, right? It may be a generic kind of overlay component that you may want to use in other places. Up to you. In the past, I've constructed an overlay component to fulfill both use cases. One where that's more generic, one that is intentionally part of the modal experience, not being used anywhere else. This one's up to you. But for now, I'm just going to say this is just part of the modal experience. We need an overlay of some kind. So the close mechanism, the close guy, the thing that is responsible for closing. This one's interesting. Just because, let's assume that it's always going to be an X. You can't change the icon for closing, right? Whoa, Siri. So for closing, we have some X icon, and that X icon typically needs to be rendered with an SVG of some kind. And not only is it an X SVG, ideally you'd want this thing to be a button. So that means you probably need some sort of icon button component in there to be able to render the X, so that if you were to tab to it, you'd get that focus style, whether it's changing the color of the X to something else, or maybe you have an outline like a circle, something. Maybe you have something like that when you do focusing. That should ideally be consistent with all of your other icon experiences, which means you need to have some sort of icon button component. So in order for you to have an icon button component, you need to have a button. You have to have both a button component and also an icon component. And For your button component, I think that's probably as low as you need to go. But for the icon component, depending on your requirements, you may need some sort of SVG primitive library. So a good example is Gutenberg WordPress. They have SVG primitives, and the reason why they have that is because the SVGs can be rendered natively with React out of the box. Not so much for React Native, and by React Native I mean how it renders on iOS and Android. For that, you need dedicated SVG components that are designed specifically for those platforms. So having a singular SVG primitive library allows you to just use those components out of the box, and then depending on where they render, they'll figure out the rest. So may be required, may not be, depending on your cases, but I thought I'd just list it right here. So for close, you need icon, button, button, icon, and also potentially some sort of SVG primitive library. Great. So that's a close. And what else do we need to render? We need to render some sort of title of some kind, right? Here we have upgrade flavor. Here we have add payments and maybe some other text, some subtitle text underneath there. So we need some sort of title. Also subtitle. Yeah. These ones may be exclusive to Modal, may not be, right? So now we're starting to get like, at this point, this feels bad for me. Just because this is a design choice. This is where you make your choices for how you want to handle how these subcomponents that may feel kind of loosely associated with your modal, how you want to handle the coupling. But what I mean by that is the title, a title and a subtitle is just text components, right? And text is something that's more universally understood within the context of your application versus whether a modal should use a card or not. You don't need to see the UI to understand that text is like a different thing compared to something like, I don't know, a footer, for example. So something that you can do is, instead of splitting those into different components, you could do something like this. So as part of your modal header, as a design choice and as a component composition, choice for component composition, you've decided to expose the properties title and subtitle, which ultimately renders these two bits within your header. That is the design choice you've made. Alternatively, I mean, the alternate is to do something like this. Let's pretend you have these components. The alternative, perhaps, is to do something like this. Subtitle, and then you write there. Here you write hello. Either one is perfectly fine. It's up to you how flexible you want your kind of modal to be. And not only that, but within the context of your application, how many ways can you and the designer foresee your modal changing its header UI? If it's almost always going to have this kind of thing where you're only ever going to render the title and the subtitle either in the middle or in the left-hand side, then maybe this is fine. But if there's lots of variations for reasons where you perhaps need to combine this with like a button or something else, then maybe this one is better. Maybe this one is a little bit better. But for now, I'm going to say we're going to go with this, where you can pass your title and your subtitle into these properties, and they will render accordingly into their place. However, we still need the components to render the actual text itself, to render the title and also the subtitle. So here, these guys aren't associated with modal, so these aren't modal titles, these aren't modal subtitles. These are just kind of base components. We have titles and subtitles. But if we go one level deeper, these guys, maybe you want to change this to a more generic thing, right? Maybe it's just heading and text. By heading, these could be your H1s to H6s, and text is just generic text that you can render within your component library. I always recommend having some sort of base text component, something like this. Let's say here, I'm just going to render text, hello. Having something like this versus this, right? So the reason for that is because your styles for rendering text, it's not always unopinionated. There is some sort of font size, there's some sort of font scaling, there's some sort of line height, there's some sort of something that is that text requires to render consistently throughout your application. It's very difficult to rely completely on global for text, just because there could be a certain something that perhaps a line height, perhaps a font size that was declared somewhere in your UI that a span text would just inherit, and now for some reason the margin is off or the line height is off or something. And the solution for this typically is for you to then, oh, well, I'll just write some sort of CSS to kind of ad hoc fix this particular thing, which over time, you can imagine this scales badly and everyone is sad. I'm sure you've been there. So that's why I recommend having some sort of base text component where type scale, color variation, sizing, line height, all that stuff is built in, so you can just use the thing out of the box. Not only that, you can have some other features built into text, like perhaps truncation or some other things. And a place that I've drawn inspiration from to do something like this is React Native, because you are not allowed to render text by itself in the context of React Native. You need to use a text component of some kind to render text. And the text component has all of these wonderful things built inside of it, like number of lines, or they have some sort of, ellipsis mode, which handles truncation, right? Whether to truncate in the beginning, middle, or end, or whatever it is. And having some sort of a text component, some raw, low-level text component to handle this stuff is wonderful. Highly recommended. And for our case, while we're planning this stuff, we're going to assume that that is the situation. So we have text to handle subtitle, heading to handle the title, but underneath the hood, heading is actually a variation of text, perhaps. So these are the components we need for this. Great. What other thing do we need? We need, well, now we have buttons, we have various other UIs that are rendered within the modal. So, because buttons are always associated with a modal, we have to make a decision. Should we have a modal button? I would argue no. Just because the button, similar to heading and text or to subtitle and subtitle, it feels quite generic. It just happens to be used within the context of the modals a lot. But I don't necessarily think that there needs to be a modal button of some kind. So I think that could be separate. All right. And oh, yes, this guy. How do we handle the scenarios for header, whether to render a header or not? So in this case, we do want to render a header. We don't want to render a header, but we want and we may have a close button. We may not have a close button. In this case, we have something else that renders a dropdown within the context of a modal. So the modal, in this case, we still need to be able to close the modal, which hopefully is provided by our portal stack system, where you press escape to close, or perhaps when you press the overlay, that is bootstrap, where are you? I got rid of it. Bootstrap, modal. Where you click on this thing and then the modal closes, right? So you need some sort of thing that's kind of that's part of the overlay that knows how to handle it if you choose not to have a close button. Right, so these are our UI parts, which is great. So it's at this point, after you've, from a high level, identified the various system and the various parts, where you make the decision of how it is you're going to go about building this thing. And I think for anything, you should do it as incrementally as possible, right? So, for example, if you need the modal relatively quickly, then perhaps you may have to skip building these like little text components, or perhaps skip building an icon button for now, just so that you can build the card components and everything that can render within, so that you can construct the modal that is now made available to your JavaScript developers or whoever. You have to make those decisions based on timeline and the requirements for your current projects and teams. The other part is your systems, right? It's at this point, let's pretend you have nothing built. You don't have any of the systems, and you're now trying to make decisions of how you're going to do this thing. This is where you would leverage third-party libraries to kind of handle this for you, just because they've already done all the hard work, and you can ride on the shoulders of giants as you go to construct your own component library and design system. So for accessibility handling and also focus trapping, we could leverage RiaKit, perhaps. Based on all the things I've examined, RiaKit is probably the best one to automatically handle these situations out of the box. For styling and theming, I would probably pick Emotion to kind of take care of that. This is a CSS and JavaScript library heavily debated on whether this is fine as part of how you, your company, your UI team, your designers, your engineers feels about style rendering and the requirements associated with it. But overall, I'm a believer in the CSS and JS systems, so I would recommend Emotion, which also gives theming out of the box as well. So let's go with Emotion. For elevation, since these are more configuration, this is something that could probably be custom built. Focus trapping is part of RiaKit, which you get out of the box, which is great. Animation, depending on how much animation you need for the context of modals, it could be something custom, or it could be something like React Spring. Whoops. Or portals. RiaKit does have some sort of portal something. However, I don't think RiaKit supports multi-portal nested dialogues. Open, close, close. Oh my goodness, Diego, my man. So RiaKit also handles nested portal escape handling. Cool. Oh wait. If I'm here and if I click the outside, if I click here, oh man. So good. If I click the outside, everything closes. If I click the underlying modal, then the first modal closes. It's great. My goodness. Cool. Custom dialogue. I'm just geeking out over RiaKit. Cool. So it looks like RiaKit handles some sort of portal stacking, which is great. Diving into RiaKit a little bit. Let's say you choose not to use RiaKit, right? There is something in here that I have to touch upon. Discard. Dialog hide. Right. So when you go to construct modals, it's not always the case where you click X to close. In this case, there's no X button. to close a modal. You may provide the user with the ability to close the modal if they pick something like cancel, which is here. So when you go to construct your modal's API, you need to be able to provide some sort of closing mechanism for them. In this case, in ReactKit, there is an object that is the dialog state, which provides a hide mechanism or hide callback that can be triggered by anything. In this case, I'm clicking the cancel button that hides it, or I'm clicking the discard button that hides it. On click, you can do anything you want. So there is some level of composition and flexibility as part of your system. So something to be mindful of if you choose to construct this thing on your own without leveraging something like ReactKit to kind of handle it for you. So we have those mechanisms, which is great. Let's see. So it doesn't look like ReactKit handles this part, but one thing that I would build as part of the API is some sort of on before open, on before close, maybe on open, on close, some sort of these callbacks, which may be part of just your general portal system API. It's helpful just because you may need to do some sort of data fetching or some sort of something, resolve some sort of interaction before you open the modal or before you close the modal, right? Just because it's not unusual where you need to perhaps save something and then close a modal or do something before you close the modal. You may not need to do this though, depending on your use cases. If you supply the ability to manually close a modal like this, right? In this case, dialog to hide, then for your on click, so let's pretend we have some sort of like const handle on click. It does a thing where it's like, I don't know, some async save function. Let's pretend this happens, and then if it's successful, then you can do dialog close. If it's not successful, catch. I can't type. My goodness, come on. If it's not successful, then you do something else. Perhaps you're evil and you want to you want to open another modal. I don't know. Dialog to open. I don't. Is there an open? There has to. Maybe. Open. I don't think there is an open API associated with this one. But let's just say open dialog. You have a nested modal situation where if something goes wrong, you want to prompt the user with something, and then within your modal, let's say you render the modal, and then modal, and inside the modal footer, you have a button on click. Come on, handle on click, and now your button does its thing. I can't right now. Things aren't working. You know what I mean. I can't paste code for some reason. So with that, you're able to handle the use cases where you need to do something asynchronous before or after you close a modal, and be able to handle like those little interactions inside. I mentioned this just because before, in my experience, I've run into a situation where you need to build some sort of async handling that is associated with the modal's render state. And if these things weren't kind of built in, then trying to rig all those things together becomes quite difficult. So this is just something to be mindful of. Okay, so with all of these bits, we basically have the parts and the systems and potentially the API considerations for our modal. Cool. And with that, I mean, it's still high level, just random words to describe the modal system, but you have, I think for this, you have enough to start planning out the sequencing of whatever it is you need to build in order for you to build your modal. Some closing thoughts would be, let's say it's very common within your UI to have many different modals to do many different things, right? You can have something for upgrading in your upgrade flow. You can have some sort of payment modal. You can have some sort of creation modal or whatever. From my experience, let's say you have create page. Let's say in your application you have some sort of giant creation page. Or no, this is easier. Payment page, right? And then you have, let's say it returns a container with other stuff. Other stuff. And inside you have some sort of button where they click pay, and this pay button triggers a modal of some kind. Let's pretend, right? And you need to render the modal and some other things inside based on its open state or whatever. And at this point, you need to render whatever UI that's super custom for your payment modal, right? I recommend you do something like this. Payment modal. You create a brand new component just for your modal, where you would leverage the base modal underneath, and you would use this payment modal component instead. The trap I've seen people fall into is they don't take the time to create like a medium-sized component to fulfill the flow or the UI they need for their application. They take the small atomic bits, jam them together, and then they have this gigantic 800-line massive component, right? Which, I don't know about you, for me it's very difficult to work with those guys. It's much easier to construct these kind of in-between mediary components that take some state, take the base components, and kind of like mash them together so that they can be used a little bit more. They can be used within the context of your larger component, like so. And now you can do something like is open based on reasons. And inside here, there may be a let's pretend this is a fragment, right? And inside here, there is a button, pay. So the button and the modal are kind of bound together, and you have a singular experience for your payment modal. And you would construct all these various modals perhaps throughout your entire application. You don't just have modal, you may have like alert modal, payment modal, creation modal, or whatever for your use case. And through doing this, you may find that you could then use your pre-constructed payment modal in multiple places, not just on the payment page. Maybe you need to open a modal on the, on the item listing page in order to prompt the user for payments if they missed a payment, or perhaps to encourage an upgrade cycle or something like that, right? It's nice to have these intermediary bits so that you can reuse across other things. And the interesting thing that you may find when you start constructing these intermediary bits is what belongs in a component library or design system and what belongs in my application. The line gets very blurred the more that you start seeing like a thing being used, right? So if you start seeing payment modal show up all over the place, right? And you're starting in your application, you're starting to like need to jam lots of props inside of your payment modal for reasons like, I don't know, is user something, is open, is, I don't know, is what else can you do inside of a payment modal? I don't know. Oh wait. Value, currency, I don't know what it is. Let's say your payment modal, you start to need to like have lots of little props and lots of little things to configure whatever. And you're noticing that you're needing this component not just within your application, but perhaps some other application that leverages the same component library as your current one. App A and App B, they both use the same centralized component library. It's at that point then perhaps payment modal can be graduated in a way into your design system, into your component library, because you found a component that is used heavily enough that requires micro customizations for a common pattern. That's where you as a UI engineer, JavaScript engineer, or whoever, this is where you kind of have to make the decision as a team, right? When you start noticing variations in modals, or doesn't matter, any kind of components start popping up every now and then, and you're noticing them appear a lot more within your application, and these are common patterns. That's the time where you can graduate something like this into your design system or into your component library. Otherwise, I think it's perfectly fine to kind of do this kind of, let me just create a separate dedicated modal component just for this environment so that I can encapsulate the UI and the logic just for the modal experience. That way, the UI and the logic isn't bloated within your main payment page or wherever the case may be. So, yeah. And I think with that, we have established the various system that goes inside of a modal, the various UI parts, the breakdown of the UI parts, API considerations, composition, and also when to perhaps create intermediary components that are based off a base modal component within your application, and potentially when to graduate these components into your component library or design system. And with that, I'm going to conclude this live stream or video, whatever this is. And thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Catch you later. Bye.